Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode is a solo effort, just me, and it's talking about. I don't know that there can be much debate on this point. The best manager in the history of professional wrestling. This is me talking about Bobby Heenan, who was again. I'm going to go into again. The show goes into it, but one of the one of the true geniuses of professional wrestling. Um, Not too many people just had his gift, and he maximized it. And this is me talking about him. This was part of my series looking at the wonderful world of professional wrestling. And Bobby Heenan was such a tremendous presence and character and personality that I decided he needed his own show instead of simply being kind of an addendum onto talking about one of the eras that he happened to occupy. So this is a full episode devoted to Bobby the Brain Heenan. I'll throw it to my past self. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
When the devil is too busy and debt's a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pest in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wiggle and writhe, and it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me, I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
Hello and good evening, everyone, or whatever time of day it happens to be when I find you listening to this. I am Robert Winfree, and this is Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, your normally weekly dose of all things villainous. And I would really just love to thank you all so very much for choosing to listen to this podcast. I know how many choices there are, some of them much better promoted, some of them with much better hosts, some of them on bigger networks, all that fun stuff, but you have chosen this one, probably in addition to several of those other professional, better promoted ones and what have you, and I appreciate that. I really can't stress enough how much knowing that you guys are out there listening to this, telling your friends about it if you think they'd enjoy the show, all that good stuff. I appreciate it. Thank you all so very much for that. Before we delve into tonight's topic, I need to apologize to everyone. For fans of the show, this is the first show in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks. I was a little out of one time it was physical. I had a really bad Thursday and Friday. It was unpleasant, and there's a certain establishment I will not be frequenting anymore. Just go ahead and put it that way. And last week, I don't know, my head wasn't in it. I wasn't all the way where I needed to be, and that's on me. So to fans of this show, I really do apologize for the couple of weeks off. I know I don't get paid for this, so I'm not necessarily beholden to anyone, but you deserve the best show that I can do. You deserve it consistently, and I've failed to give that to you for a couple of weeks. I didn't give you anything, and again, so I apologize. But I remember where we left off. Last time around, I remember what's going on here. We are still delving through the world of professional wrestling, sort of anthology style. Another kind of break from the timeline, which will functionally resume next week. I'm not sure how I want to do this. I've debated a couple of different ways of going about it, but I think I'll announce at the end of this show how I plan on going forward with this. And that's going to be, but tonight we're going to be talking about probably the best all-around performer in the history of professional wrestling. The whole genre, any role, this guy could do it and make everyone else look just like they had no idea what they were doing. No, this is not Shawn Michaels. This is not Bret Hart. No. We are going to the best all-around, put him anywhere guy in the history of any promotion he was ever in. Bobby the Brain Heenan. He's going to be the subject of discussion tonight. I don't have a co-host. This is on me again. I should have tried to set this up earlier, but it turns out I spent most of the day running around the university trying to get stuff sorted out because, I don't want to get into it. It's personal, it's moderately aggravating, and there's nothing I can do but slog through it, and you're here to listen to, again, talking about Bobby the Brain Heenan, who can make just anything better. His mere presence makes things better. So the fact that we're just talking about him will elevate my mood, and things will be so I'm planning on spending an hour or so here talking with you. And here's the other thing I should mention. Again, I don't have a regular host, but because of that, I'll go ahead and just kind of throw the phone lines wide open. If you're a fan of Bobby Heenan, if you're listening to this live, and I am aware that unintentionally I'm competing with live time. I'm competing for live time with Larry Zonka, my boss over at 411 Mania, so I don't anticipate I'll have necessarily the same live listeners that I might under normal circumstances. But if you are listening live, if you're a fan of Bobby Heenan's, you have a story to tell, you just want to reminisce, whatever have you, I'm going to go ahead and tell you all how to make contact. The phone number is 323-657-0901. Once again, 323-657-0901. If you're listening live on the Blog Talk Radio page, there's a little Skype icon at the top of the player, right about in the middle. Give that a click through some dialog boxes, and you'll show up in my switchboard, and I will get you on that way if you don't want to make a long-distance phone call, and I completely understand that. So again, those are the two ways of getting in touch here if you would like to talk about Bobby Heenan. In the intro, I'm flying solo, and we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Now, when I said at the top of this, Bobby Heenan is the best all-around performer in the history of professional wrestling, I don't feel that's an exaggeration. Look at the roster, the volume of things that Bobby Heenan did. Started off as a manager, in the AWA. He was, I believe, hands down, the greatest manager of all time. I don't think anyone comes all that close. Yeah, there are some great other managers. J.J. Dillon was great. Gary Hart was great. Paul Heyman, still doing good things, is the only real manager left in seemingly the whole wide world of professional wrestling. But I don't think anybody did what was as good as Bobby Heenan. Now, he started in the AWA, and among his first charges, this is an odd relationship kind of dynamic, I was talking about the other things he could do. Bobby Heenan could wrestle. And by wrestle, bear in mind, we're not talking about a mat, technical classic, hold for hold, high flying stuff. No, none of that. But Bobby was there to take bumps because everyone in the world wanted to see him get his comeuppance after he talked a ton of crap and hid behind his guys and made Hulk Hogan's life miserable, made the Ultimate Warrior's life miserable. They all wanted to see Bobby Heenan get what was coming. And he could get in there and he could perform in the ring. And when he stopped being able to really take bumps, he transitioned to commentary. And his tandem with Gorilla Monsoon is remembered very fondly by anyone who ever listened to it, because they were a glorious tandem. You had Bobby just kind of being the obnoxious heel, and you had Gorilla with trying to bring credibility and being the straight man and trying to keep Bobby in line. And it was, again, from an announcing standpoint, it's a great duo. And it's one of the all-time classics. Heenan on commentary did so much to put over the guys in the ring. This is a monumentally overlooked part of commentary. And it's one of my substantial issues with the current product when I bother to watch it. Listening to the trio of Michael Cole, JBL, and Jerry the King Lawler, I almost never feel like they're actively trying to put over the talent that's in the ring. Now, some of that's coming through their headsets and the direction and all the other information and stuff they have to plug. Some of it is they just don't seem to place a priority on it personally. And I'll go ahead and give you an example. It was pointed out to me. When Shawn Michaels first broke away from Marty Jannetty, I'm going to kind of bounce around here a little bit. This won't be strict chronology, but so just for anyone out there. But when he first broke away, first of all, listening to Bobby Heenan on commentary during that barbershop segment with the Rockers when when Shawn famously threw Marty Jannetty through the window. For Bobby Heenan on commentary to go, in one moment, now see, they're tag team specialists. One doesn't make sense without the other. No, I knew there was nothing to these rumors. Shawn super kicks Jannetty, and Bobby goes, oh, I knew he was going to do that. Throws him through the window. Oh, he didn't need him anyway. No. He's so much. I mean, just the utter duplicitousness. I'm not entirely sure that's the correct way to phrase that word under the tense that I'm using it, but the ability of Bobby Heenan to go back and forth like that on commentary, and the fact that he followed that up by whenever he was doing something. Now, for those of you who maybe weren't watching at the time or aren't familiar with this, but once Shawn Michaels split away from Marty, started the heel gimmick that he had, his heel run, he would be in one of the opening, 1, 2, or 3 matches. At some point after his match, he would have them say over the PA system or what have you, attention, ladies and gentlemen, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, has left the building. And Bobby Heenan would do that on commentary. And it was glorious. In the middle of whatever he was doing, I've just been handed an important note, Shawn Michaels has left the building. It made Shawn, now don't get me wrong, Shawn, it's all part of Shawn's character, but it helped him feel like, something more than just another mid-card guy. It all added to the presentation. I'll go ahead and throw another example at you from his commentary days, and I wish I could remember the full match here, but I'm not necessarily a wrestling historian. There's a triple threat match. Ric Flair, I believe, is WWF champion, defending against a triple threat, and one of the guys was Roddy Piper, and I forget who the other one was. So if anyone out there knows, feel free to call in, number 323-657-0901, or on the Blog Talk page, click the Skype button. But the other guy was trying to pin Ric Flair, was about to pin him. Roddy comes over, breaks up the pin, and Bobby Heenan on commentary, who was managing Flair at the time. Oh, I'll say it. I love you, Roddy. I'll say it. It's a kilt. It's not a skirt. It's a kilt. You glorious because he just saved him. Then a moment later, Roddy kicks Flair in the head, and Bobby's response immediately and predictably, oh, you skirt-wearing turncoat. It's not a kilt. It's a skirt. How could you do that to Flair? I mean, just, again, the ability to go back and forth like that on a dime and seem like he was being completely straight with it. And that's the thing. Bobby was a presenter. He was over the top in the sense that every bit of professional wrestling when he was out there was kind of over the top. But he did everything straight. He never broke character. He never, laughed to himself. He never seemed like he was out of sorts. He was always on the ball. And commentary in the ring when he needed to be in the ring, as a manager, as whatever you needed Bobby Heenan to do, he could do it. And there's a great quote from Nick Bockwinkel, and I believe this was included in the WWE's documentary on Bobby Heenan. I couldn't tell you when it came out off the top of my head, but they were interviewing Nick, and at the time Bobby Heenan was managing the tag team of Nick Bockwinkel and Ray the Crippler Stevens in the AWA. Nick's quote was, it was great because there was never a problem. If Ray or I couldn't make a town, Bobby could get in the ring with us and do whatever, and the crowd would be just as hot for Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan, or Ray Stevens, or Ray the Crusher, or the Crippler. God, I can never keep those two straight. Ray Stevens and Bobby Heenan, as they would for the two of them together. Bobby Heenan could get in the ring and do whatever Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens could. Now, considering the talent that those two men possessed, that's not a small statement. If you listen to the podcast that I had, again, that I kicked off kind of my pro wrestling look with Pat Mullen, we spent a solid 5 to 10 minutes talking about just how great Nick Bockwinkel was in the ring and on the mic, and Ray Stevens, in terms of just between the ropes, bell to bell, arguably the best ever. So for Nick Bockwinkel to say Bobby Heenan could do whatever Ray and I could do, but there's no way we could do what Bobby could do. It didn't matter where Bobby Heenan was. He was able to entertain the people, to get his charge over, which is one of the big things that kind of gets overlooked, because we all look back and we remember how great Bobby Heenan was, but at the time, kind of the greatness of Bobby Heenan was you could pair him with anybody, and he would do everything in his power to get that person over. And Bobby understood how to not only have heat on himself, which was good, but to deflect that and to also kind of transfer it to his charge. Because that was, again, kind of the key, was you could pair anybody with Bobby Heenan, and he could make them feel like a big deal. Now, again, Heenan, also, from all reports, a real stand-up guy, and one of the reasons I say that, when Vince McMahon was trying to expand the World Wrestling Federation, he bought several talents from the AWA. Now, we're entering the realm of professional wrestling rumor here, but the rumor is that some of these guys who had been booked, like Hulk Hogan, who've been taken off, I think there were a couple of other people, maybe Jesse Ventura, don't quote me there, but they were contracted by the then World Wrestling Federation, and they were offered more money on their new deals to sit home than to appear on their dates for the AWA. Now, they were never told, don't make your dates, anything like that, but if you're getting paid more to stay home as opposed to then go and perform in a ring and, take bumps and potentially injure yourself, it seems like a no-brainer. Of that group of guys, and I swear there were like 4 or 5, who got that deal, the only one who stayed in the territory, worked the last of his days before he left, was Bobby Heenan. And there's a degree of just, being a good guy as far as that goes. And Bobby was, again, from all reports, just a great guy to be around. Now, as a manager, he started in the AWA, Winkle, and that was, again, my point earlier, if you've stuck with me this far, but earlier I made the point about that being kind of an odd pairing, and that was simply because Nick Bockwinkel did not need a mouthpiece. Nick Bockwinkel was a very good talker, a very good communicator. He could talk you into a building. Again, back in those days, you had a manager so that you could pair him with a guy who couldn't talk. That would help him get heat. You had a guy who had maybe a good physical presence, maybe could really go in the ring, but couldn't talk. That was the function of the manager. Again, if you listen to the other show, guys like Gary Hart getting paired with Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah the Butcher looks like an absolute monster. If you ever heard the guy talk, that all goes right out the window. As soon as he opens his mouth, because he has a very kind of high-pitched voice. It's very non-intimidating. I mean, it's almost comical coming out of a guy his size. So you pair him with the manager wherever you happen to be. Again, Gary Hart did that in kind of WCCW, some of the other Southern territories. You bring Gary Hart along with Abdullah the Butcher. And, Bobby Heenan definitely managed guys who couldn't talk, but he was paired with Bockwinkel, and it was just, for a contemporary analysis, if you guys want to understand kind of the level of reaction they were getting, think about heel CM Punk and Paul Heyman as his manager. Kind of the same thing. Bockwinkel, one of, just absolute genius in the ring, smooth, conditioned, never missed a beat, just, again, one of the all-time greats, and a great talker. He could absolutely talk you into a building. He could make you want to see him lose. He could sit there and again, his visual style and his verbal presentation were very much copied by Ric Flair when Ric Flair started really hitting his stride as the NWA champion in Jim Crockett promotion. But great communicator, could make you think, he went there, he carried the belt, I'm the greatest professional athlete in the world, I'm smarter than all of you, I'm better than anyone that you can put in the ring with me, and people wanted to see him lose. Much like CM Punk during his heel run. Good in the ring, good on the mic, all-around package, talking about how long he'd been champion, all great stuff. You factor in Paul Heyman to that, CM Punk does not need a mouthpiece, clearly. But the presence of Heyman just added a little something extra, added another wrinkle to it, added another guy, another great communicator who could maybe be a factor at ringside, who could potentially sway people who might have cheered him, kind of by what he said and by his presence. And that's what Bobby Heenan did. Because, and again, Bockwinkel was in the AWA for a long time, one of the pillars of that promotion. Him and Vern Gagne, kind of the two pillars of the AWA. Now, you add in Bobby Heenan, not because Bockwinkel necessarily needs a mouthpiece or doesn't know how to be a heel, but because he's been there for so long and he's such a talented performer, you just want to avoid even the chance that people start cheering for him. So to do this, you pair him with Bobby Heenan, who will get on the mic and he will talk about how smart he is, how much smarter he is than all of you. How he has the plan. He will run down his opponent. He will run down the town and the people that he's with. I believe he's the one who started calling all the fans humanoids as a pejorative, mind you. And you just have that extra layer of, man, maybe maybe could be some respect for Bockwinkel because he is that good, but he's associated with Bobby Heenan, and I want to see Bobby Heenan get crushed. And Bobby Heenan, just really, really good stuff. And again, great promo, great ability to make people hate him. He was in the ring. If he was involved in a match, it was the right place at the right time. And he also, again, I mentioned this, he knew how to take bumps. When it was time for Bobby Heenan to get what was coming to him, he'd get in the ring and he'd get what was coming to him. And he bumped and he debatably oversold, but again, he's a manager and he's in there with a professional wrestler. And he'd take his beating like he was supposed to, and he'd make his money doing it. But I believe that Bobby Heenan was one of the most pivotal, one of the key pieces on the chessboard for the WWF exploding in popularity. Now, if you listen to the last show, I believe it was the last show, please don't quote me too much on that, but when Pat Mullen and I talked about Roddy Piper and how absolutely integral he was to the first WrestleMania, to the Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania explosion, Roddy Piper was absolutely the perfect guy for that. He and Hogan were made to just be there against each other and to have that whole thing happen. It's debatable if you believe in this sort of thing. That's what they were put on this earth to do. And I wouldn't dispute that for 1 second. But going forward from that, Bobby Heenan started with managing the Heenan family, which was just a group of guys whose only connecting point was they were managed by Bobby Heenan, which is fine and dandy. I mean, there aren't stables at this point in time in the sense that we all have come to understand them. Nowadays, you need guys who have a connected theme or something like that. And this is kind of where you get guys like DX or Evolution or the Shield or the Wyatt family. They are what we kind of understand stables to be. Back in the day, I mean, again, the original Legion of Doom, and I believe I mentioned this, was the Spoiler, Jake Roberts, King Kong Bundy, the Legion of Doom. Bundy may or may not have been in there. No, he wasn't. We talked about that extensively, actually. But it was just a bunch of guys who happened to be managed by Paul Ellering. They weren't necessarily a group. And the Heenan family did not have, again, this big overarching, kind of theme to them other than Bobby Heenan managed. Kind of the same thing with when Ted DiBiase started with getting his $1 Million group together and whatnot. Slightly different in that some of them had some of the subtext there. I mean, he teamed up with, again, Erwin R. Shyster, good old IRS, to be part of Money Inc., but a lot of them, a lot of them were just kind of guys who were on the $1 Million Man's payroll. Well, Bobby Heenan went on TV more than once and said, my goal in this business is to manage the world champion. That's what he wanted to do. That was the sole, and it's a completely understandable thing. Bobby Heenan, manager, greatest manager ever, even then, one of the greatest, wants to manage the world champion, something he's never done. And he can't, and the problem is the world champion in the World Wrestling Federation is Hulk Hogan, the paragon of all that is good in the world. And there's no way Hogan is going to lay down for Bobby Heenan. He's not going to surrender the belt. And he doesn't want Heenan managing him because within the realm of the story, he knows the type of guy Heenan is. So he says, no, not interested. And Heenan then decides that it's his goal in life to get the world title off of Hogan and onto one of his guys. That is his goal, and he proceeds to throw everything but the kitchen sink at Hulk Hogan. Tries over and over again to get the belt off of him. It fails, again, consistently, because that's what you're supposed to do. That's the way the World Wrestling Federation at the time was booked. It was a babyface territory. But WrestleMania 2, I believe King Kong Bundy was under the Heenan family at the time. And Bobby Heenan just really wanted to manage the world champion, and Hogan was just he was not going to sign a contract with Heenan. He was not going to lay down for a Heenan guy. And that was kind of the machine that the World Wrestling Federation was using to build their brand, to build their awareness, and to build Hulk Hogan. Instead of having Hogan feud with, again, Roddy Piper for a year building to a WrestleMania blow-off and then moving on, or King Kong Bundy or Paul Orndorff or any of these other guys. The central theme and the central feud for a long time was not Hogan versus next guy. It was predominantly Hogan versus Heenan. And Bobby Heenan would just find new guys. And then that was kind of the overarching theme, was trying to get the belt off of Hogan and onto one of his guys. And it's a really kind of brilliant philosophy in that it doesn't matter how many times Hogan gets the win over his opponent, because they're not really the ones he's competing against. I mean, sure, they're the ones in the ring, but if he can't find some way to get around Bobby Heenan, it doesn't matter, because Heenan's just going to find another guy, and that guy is then going to challenge for the title because Bobby Heenan will manage him into that position. Such as the greatness of having a great manager, he will get you title shots. And Heenan, again, had a bunch of other guys who were not challenging for the belt. I mean, again, bring up WrestleMania 1, he was managing Big John Studd, took out Andre the Giant. Heenan deciding to steal, I forget how much money it was on, like the $1,000 or $10,000 body slam challenge, because nobody could slam Big John Studd. Well, Andre the Giant, and had the body slam match. Andre won, because he's Andre, got the money from the duffel bag that Bobby had, and he started throwing it into the crowd, and Bobby Heenan's response was to run up the bag away from Andre and then run through the crowd, back up the aisle with as much of the money as he could possibly maintain. Because he hated losing and he hated lost money. I mean, but one of the key moments kind of that to me at least cements how important Bobby Heenan was the Piper's Pit prior to WrestleMania 3, the one that kicked off the big showdown between Hulk and Andre. I believe that had Andre come out on his own, challenged Hulk Hogan for the world title, even if he had done it as a heel, not as the face versus face thing, but just Andre the Giant as a heel without Bobby Heenan, that doesn't go over quite as well. You have Bobby Heenan come out first and say, "You've been ducking this man. I've got someone. I'm finally going to get to live my dream because there's no way you can beat Andre the Giant." Andre comes out with Heenan, essentially leaves with Heenan. Hogan's on when he has the mic. What are you doing with this guy, Andre? And Heenan's over there. No. You've held this guy down. You've not given him a shot. You say you've been friends, but what have you done for him? And I mean, we get that whole great segment. I mean, there's nothing but greatness in that segment. Hogan, Piper, Heenan, and Andre. I mean, it's just greatness from start to finish. But having Bobby Heenan, the arch nemesis of Hulk Hogan, the antithesis of Hulkamania, the guy who everybody wanted to see fail and fail miserably because he'd go out there and it didn't matter if you chanted Weasel at him. I mean, he could play like it got under his skin, but his guy was going to win more often than not, unless they were fighting Hogan. But again, different story. And you wanted to see him get it, and he comes out with Andre, and Hogan and Andre would have been, purely kind of from a narrative, from a fan's perspective, would have been hard enough to have Hogan win, because nobody had beaten Andre in years, and he's Andre the frickin' Giant. But you add in that little wrinkle of Bobby the Brain Heenan is with Andre the Giant. Heenan's not afraid to get involved if the match calls for it. And here comes, and it's just enough of an extra little wrinkle to the story that not only does Hogan have to overcome Andre the Giant, which no one's done in, again, many, many years, you've also got to overcome the presence of Bobby Heenan at ringside, who has been trying forever to get Hulk Hogan off of his throne and to get one of his guys with the belt around their waist. And Heenan added so much to the presentation of Andre as a heel. I don't think it works nearly as well without Heenan there. Because you had Andre as, again, years and years as the fun-loving giant who would, he'd show up and he was always smiling and shaking hands with the kids, and he was a great attraction, and he was a huge baby face. Everyone loved Andre. It's hard. I mean, even in even in the mid to late '80s, it was hard to just kind of forget all of the good times and the good memories you had with Andre, just because he wanted a title shot. I mean, there's a degree of, again, if he'd come out on his own and made that point, maybe he's got some, maybe there's some substantive claims there. You can't you don't just dismiss it. And again, you have all these years of goodwill and him as a good guy and being cheered and being loved by the fans that everyone has to remember. He comes out with Bobby Heenan, who everybody hates. All of that goes out the window just because Heenan is there with him. And it's just one of the, again, a great pairing. Bobby Heenan in the main event of WrestleMania 3 turns in a great performance in that he never distracts from the match, but is always kind of there. And honestly, when he and Andre are on the motorized cart going back up the ramp, and Andre's pointing at Hogan, and I actually beat you, which was the dispute from that very first body slam attempt, Bobby Heenan has one of the greatest bits of nonverbal communication that you can have. He's standing there with his arms on the ropes, his head down on his arms, and the impression I always got from that posture as they were going back up was that Bobby Heenan was sad, was severely disappointed, but he was thinking. He was not beaten by this particular setback. He's sitting there, and he had a great suit. For that event, he had a great suit. It was going to be the crowning night of his life, of his managerial career, because Andre was going to beat Hogan in his mind. And he's wearing the white suit to be just a little more of a douchebag. And it doesn't go his way. And even after this defeat, as they're going back up the ramp, Bobby Heenan is not throwing a temper tantrum. He is thinking about what are we going to do next? This is a setback. This is clearly not good, but what can I do next? What can I further do? This is a battle lost, but the war is going to continue, and it would continue, actually. Forget the event. But again, the big thing was you had the rematch between Hogan and Andre, and you had Andre theoretically winning the belt despite Hogan kicking out, and this is the introduction of the evil referee, Earl Hebner. And it took a big scheme like that, and then I believe it was Jack Tunney, who was president at the time, to kind of summarily come out and say, no, at WrestleMania we're going to hold a tournament, and Bobby Heenan got all flummoxed again. But he was just so good from start to finish at the presentation of his character. And this is something that I feel is just completely lost in a lot of ways especially in contemporary wrestling. But it didn't matter what was going on. Bobby Heenan knew what his character was doing, and he knew how it should come across. He should be scared if he was going to get in the ring with the Ultimate Warrior. He should be sneaky and take a couple of cheap shots and maybe even trip up the Warrior and help Rick Rude become the Intercontinental Champion. He could one of my favorites, and this might be an odd one for some of you, but there was when I believe it was Rick Martel and Jake Roberts were feuding after when Martel blinded him. No, I am confusing that. This is actually the feud between Rude and Jake Roberts. When Jake Roberts was about to get his hands on Rick Rude, Bobby Heenan, if you've ever seen the Jake the Snake DVD, it's on there this moment. Bobby comes out, distracts Jake, and then does a lucha-esque leap top rope all the way to the floor and runs with Rude back up the aisle. The man was, when he needed to be, light as a feather, getting out of that ring in a hurry. Again, this was a leap, and feel free, look it up, because he goes over that rope all the way to the floor without missing a beat, and looks like, again, this is the type of maneuver that you see professional guys in the lucha libre style in Mexico pull off. And Bobby looked fantastic doing it. And, of course, it fit perfectly with his character because Jake Roberts might actually kill him, and he wants nothing to do with Jake Roberts. But just, again, because it makes sense, this is not him showing off his athleticism. This is the character of Bobby Heenan getting the hell out of Dodge before Jake Roberts turns around and drives his head through the mat. And I really just can't say enough about when which leads into this, of course, Bobby Heenan, and I mentioned this before, but man, oh man, could he bump. Because everybody, and this was kind of the culmination of any feud with the Heenan family, was you get to a match that if you won, either you got time in the ring with Heenan or he had to wear the weasel suit, which was a great one. That was actually started in the AWA, was where the whole weasel thing started. And, oh man, Bobby Heenan could look at a crowd. Just look at him. and you'd hear the Weasel chant build. And it would start maybe the first, 4 rows, give or take, and then it would just build and fill the arena because everybody hated Bobby Heenan. Everybody wanted Bobby Heenan. Again, they wanted to see him get crushed. And but again, maybe the camera's not even on him, but he looks at the crowd, he gets that crowd going. And inevitably, several times in the AWA, he got stuffed into the Weasel suit. Again, because you lose the blow-off, either he or his charge loses the blow-off, gets stuffed in the suit. And then he comically just is horrified to be in this Weasel outfit and tries to get out of it, and fun ensues. I think it only happened once in the then WWF, he and the Ultimate Warrior. This was, of course, the time Warrior botched the Gorilla Press Slam, the military press. I forget which, but I'll call it the Gorilla Press. And because it drops him, and Bobby came down. He came down a little wrong. Warrior didn't do it entirely properly. A little, a little on both sides, and it messed up his shoulder very famously. But he then gets stuffed in the Weasel suit, and even with a messed up shoulder, mind you, Bobby Heenan then proceeds to wake up after being hit and pinned in the Weasel suit and still flail around, slip, fall desperately, as though it's like the thing's on fire. That's how he reacts to being in the Weasel suit. And I can't imagine being in, it must have been painful. Whatever happened, it was his shoulder, it was his collarbone, it was something in that area that got jacked up, and doesn't slow him down one bit for that bit of him having to sell the absolute shame and humiliation he feels by being stuffed into the Weasels. Here's the other thing, and this is another kind of instance of Bobby being with a guy who maybe didn't need him, but when Ric Flair came to the WWF, and you had Bobby Heenan come out with the WCW at the time belt. It was the NWA belt. I think, they hadn't quite made the transition full on into World Championship. It was still the NWA belt, the big gold belt. And you had Bobby Heenan come out, and I believe Hogan was the champion at the time, and it was vacated. I forget the exact chronology there. So feel free to send me angry messages for not remembering specifically how it went. I understand. And he started parading around with the belt, saying he had the real world champion under his tutelage. And he added to the Ric Flair presentation. Now, Ric Flair, great talker, great communicator, didn't really need a mouthpiece again. But you had Bobby Heenan there, and Kurt Hennig, I think, was part of that whole presentation as well. But just having that little bit of extra oomph, that little extra bit of sizzle that you got with Heenan managing Flair was a bit. I mean, if you want one of the all-time greatest commentary performances, and there's a lot of them to choose, look back at. This is where I'm going to get flack, everybody, because I can't remember if it was the 91 or the 92 Royal Rumble. But the title was vacated following the events of, it was following, I believe, the controversy from the series from a couple of matches between The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan. The Undertaker won the belt with an assist from Ric Flair. He lost it back a few days later to Hogan, but because of all the shenanigans and whatnot, it was declared vacant and it would be decided at the Royal Rumble. This is the one famously where Flair comes in at number 3, goes like 60 minutes, and Bobby Heenan on commentary with his man Ric Flair in the Royal Rumble for the belt is just from start to finish. As soon as Flair gets in that ring, Bobby Heenan does his darndest. Every time there's a break in the action, where's Flair? Oh, there he is. No, Flair's not out yet, and Gorilla Monsoon as his partner trying to do things a bit straighter, and every 5 minutes it seems Bobby Heenan on commentary. Because they mentioned, they still do this, mind you, but back then they talked a bit about who had been in the longest, and Bobby Heenan on commentary seems like 5 minutes was going, and how long is that for Flair? You'd have to, in my Gorilla Monsoon or someone else would have to kind of go, all right, no, or no, that's so long for Flair, and then Heenan would get to kind of rub it in everyone's nose that Flair was still out there. And then Flair wins the whole thing, and Bobby Heenan's celebration on commentary is great, and it's the fact that it's cut short because he takes off the headset and he charges into the ring and he celebrates with Flair, and then you have the famous backstage promo, Ric Flair with a tear in my eye, this is the greatest day in the history of my career. Heenan being this is the other thing. That leads into kind of the famous WrestleMania match between Flair and Savage, which was not the main event, which I try not to take stuff like that too seriously, but that one irks me just a little bit. I mean, you have Ric Flair and Randy Savage, and you can't put them in the main event? Instead, we get Hogan and Sid, and a run-in from Papa Shango, and a save by the War. I mean, odd choices, I feel, but great match, which is slightly more. But Heenan on commentary for the Savage versus Flair match, wherein he blatantly ignores the Ric Flair cheating, the staple of Ric Flair's offense, and constantly talks about, Miss Elizabeth not being a woman of pure virtue, and and then after all the cheating, of which there are copious amounts, mind you, which is, again, deliberate, but the fact that Savage wins with a roll-up and a handful of tights sends Bobby Heenan into just absolute fits. He nearly has an aneurysm screaming about how Savage, and it's just pure great Bobby Heenan start to finish. I mean, again, and on commentary, which is, if his charge was out there, he tried to make them seem like a big deal. Even if they weren't his charge, this is one of those very subtle things that he did so well. It didn't matter who was in the ring. He tried to make it seem like you're in the ring, you're performing on, television or pay-per-view or what have you. It's a big deal. And part of that is it's another thing that's been lost from a contemporary standpoint. But again, as a guy who could do everything, Bobby Heenan, again, everything. When he had to wrestle, Bobby Heenan could wrestle. As a manager, he got his charge, he got his clients all kinds of attention, all kinds of heat. On commentary, he was able to call the action, to put over everything going on in the ring. And he was just so... And this is kind of what I feel eventually got us all to love Bobby so much, is after, we were, maybe for everyone growing up at the time, looking back at what he said and what he did, you wanted him to just, again, get his face crushed in. As you grew up, as you became an adult, as you thought back on it with a little perspective, boy, he was funny. He was entertaining. He could do anything he wanted. I mean, this is another thing that comes out of the Bobby Heenan documentary DVD. But I think someone said if he wanted to, if he had just gone into show business, he could have been Bob Hope. And here's the crazy thing about that statement. Now, first of all, I know there are probably a fair number of you listening who don't know who Bob Hope is, which is fine and dandy. Look him up. But that's not too far off the money. I mean, for the love, when the WWF at the time was trying to fill some content, they gave Bobby Heenan his own variety show, his own talk show. That was just like The Tonight Show or like the Bob Hope Show. You had Bobby Heenan. And his show, and I've seen some episodes of it, and I mentioned this the last time I was on when we talked about stuff that's not on the WWE network that should be. I brought up the Bobby Heenan show because it should be on there. Bobby Heenan was funny, and he was engaging, and just from start to finish, whenever he was on screen, there was entertainment to be had. So yeah, WWE Network, to the unpaid intern who happened to stumble across this. Get to the guys, talk with them. I don't know how much work you're going to have to do, but get the Bobby Heenan show up on there. You got people paying for that stuff. We need more Bobby Heenan. I'll just go ahead and say it like that. But he was so entertaining in everything he did. It was great. He could make you laugh. Again, his whole shtick of saying that Roddy Piper wore a skirt for, it seemed like years. And then again, I mentioned this kind of at the top of the show, but the moment, I'll say this because you saved Flair. It's not a skirt. It's a kilt. You're a good man, Roddy Piper. And then Piper turned and smacked Flair and Bobby. And, you skirt wearing dirty. It's not a kilt. It's a skirt. How do you call yourself a man wearing a skirt like that? And he was so good at insulting people, and he was so quick-witted. And his ability to improvise, which this is the true kind of genius. If you watch what he does on commentary, interacting with fans, on the mic, whatever he's doing, if he has to improvise, he can. This is a common gripe I've heard about contemporary professional wrestling, that the promos are overscripted. And there's truth to that. Now, I'll go ahead and play devil's advocate here for just a little bit. Not everybody can actually talk. Some guys do better if you sit down with them and you script out what they're going to say. There are guys who are better that way than if you give them bullet points or if you let them go out there and just freestyle. But the only issue with scripted stuff is if you get off script or if someone throws a wrench into your rhythm or what have you, then you have some trouble. It didn't matter what you did or said to Bobby Heenan. He was able to have a comeback, to have a remark, to have something to keep you entertained. I mean, the one that gets shown all the time is Bobby Heenan. I think it might have been his talk show. It might have been something else, something else in that format. Someone in the crowd, this is doing an audience interaction. I think someone's wife is giving him trouble, and he asks the guy next to this woman, "Is that your wife?" Or something like that. The guy says, "Yeah, that's my wife." And he's just like, "How long you been married?" "Oh, 20 years. And Bobby, just without missing a beat, looks at this guy and goes, "You do realize that if you had killed her on your wedding night, you'd be out now." I mean, just so quick, off the top of his head with stuff like that. I mean, another example, his Hall of Fame induction speech, which is great, by the way. If you haven't seen the whole thing, I would encourage you to find it. The first thing I believe he says when he gets up there, this is right after Pete Rose has been inducted, is, "I have to go ahead and tell you all this. I have bet on professional wrestling." If you know the Pete Rose story, then, again, just hilarious. And it didn't matter what he did. He was funny. He was entertaining. And if he wanted you to hate him, he could make you hate him just so easily. I mean, he's one of those guys who is fondly remembered just because for so long he was so good at making you hate him. He was so good at insulting you, your family, your hometown, your wife, your dog, your favorite wrestler, and you just hated the guy because, and part of it, a good part of it was, you thought you could take Bobby Heenan. There were certain managers in the history of professional wrestling who you did not feel you could take. Again, something else that was brought up when Pat and I talked about territories, we talked about Gary Hart. Gary Hart was not a guy you thought you could take. Paul Ellering was not necessarily a guy you thought you could take. Bobby Heenan, you didn't just want to see him get pummeled, you wanted to find him and pummel him yourself. And it was, I know Bobby's still with us. I know he's got some of the health issues that have been going around, and I say this kind of sadly, but at the moment he's one of those guys who, if you read about it tomorrow, you'd be sad, but in your head you would go, that makes sense. I mean, he fought throat cancer. They removed part of his jaw. Just really sad, but he's still with us. He's still kicking, and to this day, he could still entertain any crowd anywhere if he put his mind to. And as a bad guy for the professional wrestling genre, especially in the 80s, he was beyond instrumental. Him and his ability to get heat for himself, to get heat for his clients. And bear in mind, I'm not misusing that phrase. People didn't like him. They didn't like people he represented, and they wanted to see them fail miserably, and occasionally wanted to try and kill them. Not so much in the Northeast, mind you. That's much more of a kind of a Southern reaction. I don't mean that disparagingly. I'm noting a geographic difference, mind you. But he was just so good at it, and it's a real shame that we can't. I hate to say shame, but there won't be anyone else, I don't think ever, who will have the all-around skill set that Bobby Heenan had. Because I've mentioned this before, didn't matter what you had him doing. You put Bobby Heenan in the ring, he could wrestle. He could wrestle like a manager, or under proper circumstances, he could probably have a legitimately good match. That's not what he was there to do, mind you, because he was a manager, but I believe you probably could have put him in there and he could have had a good match. He was, again, the greatest manager ever. If he told you someone was a big deal, he would, try to back it up. He would support them. He knew how to cheat, which is just the subtleties of him at ringside cheating. And when I say subtleties, I mean not everything he did was subtle. The guy's hanging off the apron, he decides, and his wrestler takes the referee over to ask him a question. Bobby then decides to bite him in the face. Not subtle, mind you, but just everything that he was able to do at ringside that added to the whole presentation of him and his group, just without peer. To anyone out there who wants to maybe get into the business, he's a guy who I would, as just a fan, say, find all the Bobby Heenan footage you can and watch what he does. Because he was so good at making, and whatever he wanted you to do. If he wanted you to hate him, he would make you hate him. If he wanted you to like him, you would like him. He just made a lot more money being hated.
but he was. I'll tell you the other kind of indelible Bobby Heenan, because Bobby Heenan, when the WWF had some financial troubles in the 90s, left, went to work for WCW, was on commentary, and Bash at the Beach, the famous turn when Hulk Hogan joined and formed the NWO. Hogan comes down after, again, Sting's been kind of incapacitated. I think Macho Man was laying down in the ring. I forget who the third guy was in that scene. It might have been Luger. Don't quote me. Hall and Nash on the other side. Hogan comes down to the ring after one of the guys has been incapacitated, and in one of the greatest bits of staying in character, Hogan comes through the curtain, and everyone says, "Here comes Hulk Hogan." Crowd goes wild. I think the first thing out of Bobby Heenan's mouth is, "Yeah, but whose side is he?" Now, this is kind of the killer, because in WCW, the announcers were not given scripts. By which I don't mean they were given scripted lines. I mean, they weren't told what was going to happen. They were not told match outcome. So nobody knew that Hogan was going to turn. So I've heard the argument that Bobby Heenan gave away the big turn. If anyone in the history of professional wrestling was going to see Hogan coming down under those circumstances and question his motives, it's Bobby Heenan, for the years and years and years that he has been saying Hogan's full of crap, and I'm trying to prove to you that he's not good, and I want to manage the champion. So many years of animosity. It only makes sense for Bobby Heenan to question Hulk Hogan. No one else would. No one else did. I mean, he said it. If you listen to the actual thing, not kind of the sanitized, dubbed version, but if you listen to the actual live call, Hogan comes down, Bobby Heenan goes, "Whose side is he on?" And Tony Schiavone immediately goes, what are you talking about? It's Hulk Hogan. And Heenan kind of backs off, and, "Oh, yeah, I guess you're right." And then, of course, Hogan does turn, and Heenan's immediate response is, "I told you all for years he was no good. I've been saying it and saying it and saying it, that Hogan is no good, and now you're all going to have to kind of eat crow." I think you also had Dusty and Tony on commentary. I mean, again, the whole thing is just indelibly is imprinted on the minds of professional wrestling fans. But Hulk Hogan, All-American, red and yellow hero, comes down, only person in the world who would think to say, "Yeah, but whose side is he on?" Bobby Heenan, and Bobby Heenan, the character. It doesn't spoil anything. It's actually one of the most gloriously in-sync moments in wrestling history for a guy, kind of like how JBL for all time hates Rey Mysterio, or there was something else. I mean, it's one of those things where no matter what side of the fence you fall on, there are certain guys who you just don't trust and you always react a certain way to. Bobby Heenan was, maybe playing a bit of a heel, but even then he was WCW and was anti-outsiders in the form of Hall and Nash. But if anybody's going to question Hogan, the only guy who would do it is Bobby Heenan, and he just happened to do it. But, Bobby, and here's one other little side note. This one struck me. I forget how long ago I wound up kind of rewatching the segment. There's a segment on in Nitro. Buff Bagwell, I believe, seriously injures his neck during a match with Rick Steiner. Steiner was going for the Bulldog off the second rope. Bagwell's head slipped out from his arm, and he wound up jamming his face into Rick Steiner's back, and that jammed up his neck. And he's laid out in the ring, and they're not doing anything because neck injuries are serious, and you don't want to move him unless it's absolutely necessary. And you've got the medics, and you've got some of the people around trying to figure out if he's okay. The guy that gets sent up, that walks up from commentary, talks to everyone and relays, as near as we can tell, the factual information is Bobby Heenan. He's the one who gets up from commentary, goes down, talks to everybody. Everybody knows him. Everybody respects him. And he's the one who kind of relays the information. That's just the relationship that he had with the business, with the fans, with, agents, the guys setting up the ring, the guys performing in the ring. Bobby was just the man. And there's just never going to be another like him. Not for a really long time. No one else will be that good everywhere. All right, that's going to wrap up our discussion of Bobby the Brain Heenan for this week. Just, again, I could talk forever about Bobby Heenan. And to anyone out there listening, if you want to, I am more than happy to revisit Bobby Heenan potentially with guests. So if anybody out there wants to maybe set up a time for another podcast and you just want to tell some stories and what have you, I'm open. Just hit me up, Twitter, Facebook, all that fun stuff. On Twitter, I'm at Winfree MMA. That's WINFREE MMA. I might be changing that in the near future. Not sure, but maybe. All right. So thank you all for choosing this podcast. I appreciate it. Next week, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, next Friday, I think because I talked with Mark Radulich a little bit about this. He mentioned what he wanted to be on for. So there's a chance I'm going to get in contact with Mark, and next Friday we're going to be tackling some Attitude Era, somewhat transitional phase into the Attitude Era. When I say transitional phase, there's a period kind of in the early to mid-90s, that business on the whole for the World Wrestling Federation was not great. But that, of course, led into what we refer to as the Attitude Era, with, all of the great stuff that comes with that. So I believe next week that's going to be the idea. I'll get Mark on. We'll talk about that period in World Wrestling Federation history. We'll talk about all the great heels from that time period, and there are some good ones. Yokozuna as a monster heel, one of the best monster heels. Yokozuna. The Undertaker has a heel run at time period, probably worth talking about. Bret Hart as the anti-American pro-Canadian. Probably some discussion of the Mr. McMahon character. We'll hash all that out. That's my plan for next week. If Mark and I can't do it, I need someone who's a big fan of WCW. And I will probably try to hit up Gavin Napier over at the Casual Heroes, because I believe he's a WCW guy. Don't quote me on that, but I'll find somebody. And we will talk about kind of from Jim Crockett Promotions through to the end of WCW. I know that's a chunk of time to cover. On the plus side, it encompasses primarily two time periods. You have the time period of Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen being the end-all, be-all evil guys in the promotion. And then you have the NWO. Now, I know, please, fans of WCW, don't send me angry letters. I know there's more to it than that. I know you had Kevin Sullivan and the Dungeon of Doom kind of running around there. Harlem Heat was a heel group for a while. You have other groups. I understand. If I were to put this into broad categories, I imagine those two groups are going to be the focus. They're going to take up the majority of the time. So those are my two options for next week. And if I can't get anybody, if I can't find anything, I can always find somebody, it seems, to talk about ECW, and I will tackle ECW. But it's one of those three. And those three, for the next 3 weeks, are actually going to be, those time periods and those promotions in particular, are going to be the focus of what we're talking about. And that will lead into the next group of time that I will cover, which is just WWE. I might be able to do, it'll probably wind up doing is drawing some line of delineation between WrestleMania 17 and WrestleMania 30, because that's a huge chunk of time to cover. And I imagine at some point in there I can draw a line and say one falls into this category, the next one falls into a slightly different category, and we can kind of chop those up. Also, I will be devoting one of these, so if I do that, if after those 3 weeks, the next one is, call it from 17 to 25, hypothetically, for WrestleManias, just as my point of delineation. If I do that one on WWE, the one after that will be TNA, and then I'll go back to wrapping up the contemporary version of WWE. So that's my plan. There's my loose outline for the upcoming future. All the great heels, some of the same people might be discussed, but different runs, different ideologies of heels. The Rock, in particular, has had a couple of different heel runs. Batista had a couple of different variations on his heel character. So we'll get into all of that. We'll get into all that good stuff. Next several weeks, I'm back. I told you, I feel good. I feel like I'm recharged as long as I don't have a major health issue on next Friday. I'll be back here. I'll have a guest, and we'll be talking another time frame, another professional wrestling promotion. And we'll drop some more knowledge, tell some more stories, and have some more fun on this show. All right. Be sure to check out the Radulich and Broadcasting Network for all of your podcasting needs. That's right, all of them. We've got politics and kind of news of the day every Tuesday. The Whiskey Rebellion, hosted by Mark Radulich. Co-stars Gavin Napier, Chris Evans, occasionally Pat Mullen. I imagine at some point, one of these days, I'll call into that show just for fun. That's your weekly news of the day, fun stuff, including Florida Man, because crazy stuff happens in Florida. If you like music, we've got that. The Metal Hammer of Doom, specifically, Mark Radulich and Robert Cooper will be they come to you every other Thursday, and they tackle something in the world, an album in the world of metal. I believe they have a Judas Priest album next. They got Ailstorm on the horizon. I'm a huge Ailstorm fan, by the way. Pirate metal. Can't go wrong. Just throw that out there. If you're a fan of MMA, I host every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern the 411 Ground and Pound radio show. It's another call-in show. Myself, usually Jeff Harris, talking the wide, wacky, wonderful world of mixed martial arts. So be on the lookout for that. This week, we'll be reviewing UFC Fight Night 47, Bader versus St. Preux, and we'll have a preview. I forgot which event is up next, but we'll have a preview because we get to kind of get back in that swing again. And this week, if you're listening to this live or not too long after it comes up this Sunday, there will also be probably a little bit of a rant because John Jones got injured, and now they have to put off his fight with Daniel Cormier, and I am personally just about up to frickin' here. I know this is an audio medium, and you can't see where my hand exists. I'm placing reference to where I am up to with this. But rest assured, it's high on my face, potentially on my head. I've had it about up to there with main event injured champions not defending their belts, and this is the first time it's happened to John Jones, and I allow that injuries happen. But Anthony Pettis not defending the belt for so long, Johnny Hendricks still on the shelf. I got beef with all of this, and there's a good chance you'll hear about it on Sunday. All right, every Thursday that you don't have the Metal Hammer of Doom, you generally have the Long Road to Ruin, which is, again, Mark Radulich and Gavin Napier. Or not Gavin Napier. Golly. Sorry. Reset. It's Mark Radulich and Sean Comer. My good friend, Sean Comer. I promise, Sean, I didn't forget you. I don't know why I spaced there, but it's Mark and Sean, and they're in the middle of a good run. They're examining Batman the Animated Series. It's their first foray into the realm of television. They wound up taking last Thursday off, but the next time around, I believe it's like the 28th, they will be tackling volumes 2 and 3 of Batman the Animated Series. So if you're a fan of, and they've already done volume 1. It's a great show. You should listen to it if you have the time. And I know you do. I know you have the time. Because maybe you're just driving, maybe you're going for a jog, maybe you're on the elliptical at the gym, whatever it is, you have time to listen to some on-demand audio. So give that show a chance. Really good show. And, of course, mine next Friday. And I believe that's everything I have to plug. So yay me. Oh, my column in the MMA Zone of 411mania.com. Highly remiss not to mention that earlier. My last one, I kind of complained about injuries, especially high-level injuries in the world of mixed martial arts and why. It's not just, you see, viewer fatigue is one thing. You run a show every week. If viewers get worn out, they can choose to skip shows. Wait for the big ones. Viewer apathy, because we just don't care that you announced John Jones and Dan Cormier, because there's no way the fight's going to happen. One of them's going to get injured. We'll deal with a replacement or a postponement. So a viewer feeling apathetic towards your fight announcements who can't get excited about a potential fight because we all know it's going to fall through due to injury. Hence my complete and utter apathy, since I've thrown that word around. I don't care that they scheduled Gilbert Melendez and Anthony Pettis. That fight's not going to happen. Anthony Pettis is made of something akin to sugar glass. He breaks if you look at him wrong. And on the off chance that he does make it through, Melendez is due for an injury. I don't think the fight's happening. So why bother getting excited about it? I was moderately excited for the rematch between Jose Aldo and Chad Mendez. That fell through. I was excited for the rematch between Jones and Gustafsson. That fell through. I then became excited about the fight between Jones and Cormier. That fell through. So look, a viewer or a follower of the sport being apathetic, worst possible thing. Because if you just don't care, you stop watching. And you'll get some of that and probably a little bit more this Sunday. And again, it's in my column, which has gotten some fairly positive reviews. Thank you all for the comments. Thank you for the reads. I'll have something else for you this week, probably related to OSP and Ryan Bader, or the upcoming event that I can't remember what it is. It might be UFC 177, or it's another I don't remember. I will have it by Sunday, and this is not the podcast. But I will have something up again this coming Friday, possibly earlier if something really strikes me. There's no limit on how many articles I can throw up. I just have been doing one a week, and that's kind of my groove. But that's everything I have to plug. Be sure to check out 411 Mania for any of their various things. They got some good stuff in the Pro Wrestling Zone going on right now, if you ignore Justin Watry, which I'd like to do so. The Casual Heroes, They have WrestleCast. They have another bunch of professional wrestling stuff. Good stuff over there, too. And come back here next Friday. I'll see you then. Until then, if we're still talking wrestling, remember, Hulk Hogan without Bobby Heenan, just a guy wearing underwear and yellow boots. With Bobby Heenan, hero. Without, crazy guy, yellow boots, and underwear. Just something to think about, everybody. Good night, and I'll see you next week.
So say good night to the bad guy.